Inside the great building of the law courts, during the interval in the hearing of Melvinsky case, the members of the Judicial Council and the public prosecutor were gathered together in the private room of Ivan Yegorovich Shibek, and the conversation turned upon the celebrated Krasovsky case. Fyodor Vasilievich hotly maintained that the case was not in the jurisdiction of the court. Yegor Ivanich stood up for his own view, but from the first, Pyotr Ivanovich, who had not entered into the discussion, took no interest in it, but was looking through the newspapers which had just been brought in. Gentlemen, he said, Ivan Ilych is dead. You don't say so. Here, read it, he said to Fyodor Vasilievich, handing him the fresh, still damp smelling paper. Within a black margin was printed, Praskovia Vredonovna Golovin, with heartfelt affliction, informs friends and relatives of the deceased, her beloved husband, member of the court justice, Ivan Ilych Golovin, who passed away on the 4th of February. The funeral will take place on Thursday at 1 o'clock. Ivan Illich was a colleague of the gentleman present, and all liked him. It was some weeks now since he had been taken ill. His illness has said to be incurable. His post had been kept open for him, but it had been thought that the case of his death, Alexiev might receive his appointment, and either Vinnikov or Stabel would succeed to Alexei's, so that on hearing of Ivan Illich's death, the first thought of each of the gentlemen in the room was of the effect of his death might have on the transfer or promotion of themselves and their friends. Now, I'm sure of getting Stabel's place or Vinnikov's, thought Fyodor Vasilievich's. It was promised to me long time ago, and the promotion means 800 rubles additional income besides the grants for office expenses. Now I shall have to petition for my brother-in-law to be transferred from Kaluga, thought uh, Pyotr Ivanich. My wife will be very glad. She won't be able to say now that I've never done anything for her family. I thought somehow that he'd never get up from his bed again, Pyotr Ivanovich said aloud. I'm sorry. But what was exactly that was wrong with him? The doctors could not decide. That's to say, they did decide, but differently. When I saw him last, I thought he would get over it. Well, positively, I haven't called there ever since the holidays. I kept meaning to go. Had he any property? I think there's something very small of his wife's, but something quite trifling. Yes, one will have to go and call. They live such a terribly long way off. A long way from you, you mean? Everything's a long way from your place. There, he can never forgive me for living on the other side of the river, said Pyotr Ivanovich, smiling at Shebek, and they began to talk of the great distances between different parts of the town and went back to court. Besides the reflections upon the changes and promotions in the service likely to ensue from this death, the very fact of the death of an intimate acquaintance excited in everyone who heard of it, as such a fact always does, a feeling of relief that it is he that is dead and not I. Only think, he is dead, but here am I all right. Each one thought Illich, who could not help thinking too that now they had the exceedingly tiresome social duties to perform of going to the funeral service and paying the widow a visit of condolence. For most intimately acquainted with their late colleague were Fyodor Vasilievich and Pyotr Ivanovich. Pyotr Ivanovich had been a comrade of his at the school of jurisprudence, and considered himself under obligations to Ivan Illich, telling his wife at dinner of the news of Ivan Illich's death and his reflections as to the possibility of getting her brother transferred to their circuit. Peter Ivanovitch, without lying down for his usual nap, put on his frock coat and drove to Ivan Illich's. At the entrance before Ivan Illich's flat stood a carriage and two hired flies. Downstairs in the entry near the hat stand there was, leaning against the wall of a coffin lid with tassels and braiding freshly rubbed with pipe clay, two ladies were taking off their cloaks. One of them he knew, the sister of Ivan Illich. The other was a lady he did not know. Pyotr Ivanovitch, colleague Schwartz, was coming down, and from the top stair, seeing who it was coming in, he stopped, winked at him, as though to say, Ivan Illich has made a mess of it. It's a very different matter with you and me. Schwartz's face, with his English whiskers and all his thin figure in his frock coat, had, as it always had, an air of elegant solemnity. And this solemnity always such a contrast to Schwartz's playful character, had a special piquancy here, so thought Pyotr Ivanovitch. Pyotr Ivanovitch let the ladies pass on in front of him and walked slowly up the stairs after them. Schwartz had not come down, but was waiting at the top. Pyotr Ivanovitch knew what for. He wanted obviously to settle with them where their game of bridge was to be that evening. The ladies went up to the widow's room, while Schwartz, with his lips tightly and gravely shut, and amusement in his eyes with a twitch of his eyebrows, motioned Pyotr Ivanovitch to the right, to the room where his dead man was. Pyotr Ivanovitch went in, as people always do on such occasions, in uncertainty as to what he would do, as to what he would have to do there. One thing he felt sure of, that crossing oneself never comes amiss on such occasions. As to whether it was necessary to bow down while doing so, he did not feel quite sure, and so chose a middle course. On entering the room, he began crossing himself and made a slight sort of bow, so far as the movements of his hands and head permitted him. He glanced while doing so about the room. Two young men, one a high school boy, nephews probably, were going out of the room, crossing themselves. An old lady was standing motionless, and a lady, with her eyebrows queerly lifted, was saying something to her in a whisper. A deacon in a frock coat, resolute and hearty, was reading something aloud, with an expression that precluded all possibility of contradiction. A young peasant who used to wait at table, Gerasim, walking with light foot, steps in front of Pyotr Ivanovitch, was sprinkling something on the floor. Seeing this, Pyotr Ivanovitch was at once aware of the faint odor of the decomposing corpse. On his last visit to Ivan Illich, Pyotr Ivanovitch had seen this peasant in his room. He was performing the duties of a sick nurse, and Ivan Illich liked him particularly. Pyotr Ivanovitch continued crossing himself and the bowing in a direction intermediate between the coffin, the deacon, and the holy pictures on the table in the corner. Then, when this action of making the sign of the cross with his hands seemed to him to have been unduly prolonged, he stood still and began to scrutinize the dead man. The dead man lay as dead men always do lie, in a peculiarly heavy dead way, his stiffened limbs sunk in the cushions of the coffin, and his head bent back forever on the pillow, and thrust up, as dead men always do, his yellow waxen forehead with bald spots on the sunken temples, and his nose that stood out sharply as it were squeezed on the upper lip. He was much changed, even thinner since Pyotr Ivanovitch had seen him, but his face, as always with the dead, was more handsome, and above all, more impressive than it had been when he was alive. On the face was an expression of what had to be done having been done and rightly done. Besides this, there was too in that expression a reproach or a reminder for the living. This reminder seemed to be Pyotr Ivanovitch uncalled for, or at least to have nothing to do with him. He felt something unpleasant, and so Pyotr Ivanovitch once more crossed himself hurriedly, and as it struck him, too hurriedly, not quite in accordance with the proprieties, turned to him and went to the door. Schwartz was waiting for him in the adjoining room, standing with his legs apart and both hands behind his back, playing with his top hat. A single glance at the playful, sleek, and elegant figure of Schwartz revived Pyotr Ivanovitch. He felt that he, Schwartz, was above it, and would not give way to depressing impressions. The mere sight of him said plainly, the incident of the service over the body of Ivan Illich cannot possibly constitute a sufficient ground for recognizing the business of the session suspended. In other words, in no way can it hinder us from shuffling and cutting a pack of cards this evening, while the footman sets four unsanctified candles on the table for us. In fact, there is no ground for supposing that this incident could prevent us from spending the evening agreeably. He said as much indeed to Peter Ivanovitch as he came out, proposing that the party should meet at Fyodor Vasilievich's, but apparently it was Pyotr Ivanovitch destined to not play bridge that evening. Praskovia Vyodorovna, a short, fat woman who, in spite of all efforts in a contrary direction, was steadily broader from her shoulder downwards, all in black, with lace on her head and her eyebrows as queerly arched as the lady standing beside the coffin, came out of her own apartments with some other ladies, and conducting them to the dead man's room, said, "The service will take place immediately. Come in." Schwartz, making an indefinite bow, stood still, obviously neither accepting nor declining this invitation. Praskovia Vyodorovna, recognizing Pyotr Ivanovitch, sighed, went right up to him, took his hand, and said, "I know you are a true friend of Ivan Ivanovitch, or Ivan Illich," and looked at him, expecting from him the suitable action in response to these words. Pyotr Ivanovitch knew that, just as before he had to cross himself, now what he had to do was press her hand, to sigh and say, "Ah, I was indeed." And he did so. And as he so did, he felt that the desired result had been attained, that he was touched and she was touched. "Come, since it's not begun yet, I have something I want to say to you," said the widow. "Give me your arm." Pyotr Ivanovitch gave her his arm, and they moved towards the inner rooms, passing Schwartz, who winked gloomily at Pyotr Ivanovitch. "So much for our bridge. Don't complain if we find another partner. You can make a fifth when you do get away," said his humorous glance. Pyotr Ivanovitch sighed, and still more deeply and despondently. Praskovia Fyodorovna pressed his hand gratefully. Going into her drawing room that was upholstered with pink cretonne and lighted by a dismal looking lamp, they sat down at the table. She sat on a sofa, and Pyotr Ivanovitch on a low ottoman with deranged springs which yielded spasmodically under his weight. Praskovia Vrodorova was about to warn him to sit on another seat, but felt such a recommendation out of keeping with her position, and changed her mind, sitting down on the ottoman. Pyotr Ivanovitch remembered how Ivan Illich had arranged this drawing room, and consulted him about the very pink cretonne with the green leaves. Seating herself on the sofa and pushing by the table, the whole drawing room was crowded with furniture and things. The widow caught the lace of her black fichu in the carving of the table. Pyotr Ivanovitch got up to disentangle it for her, and the ottoman, freed from his weight, began bobbing up spasmodically for under him. The widow began unhooking her lace herself, and Pyotr Ivanovitch again sat down, suppressing the monotonous ottoman springs under him. But the widow could not quite free herself, and Pyotr Ivanovitch rose again, and again the ottoman became mutinous and popped up with a positive snap. When this was all over, she took out a clean cambric handkerchief and began weeping. Pyotr Ivanovitch had been chilled off by the incident with the lace and the struggle with the ottoman springs, and he sat looking sullen. This awkward position was cut short by the entrance of Sokolov, Ivan Ilych's butler, who came in to announce that the place in the cemetery fixed on by Praskovia Fyodorova would cost 200 rubles. She left off weeping, and with the air of victim, glancing at Pyotr Ivanovitch, said in French that it was very terrible for her. Pyotr Ivanovitch made a silent gesture, signifying his unhesitating conviction that it must indeed be so. Please smoke, she said in a magnanimous and at the same time crushed voice. She began discussing with Sokolov the question of the price of the site for the grave. Pyotr Ivanovitch, lighting a cigarette, listened to her very circumstantial inquiries as to the various prices of the sites and her decision as to the one to be selected. Having settled on the site for the grave, she made arrangements also about the choristers. Sokolov went away. I see everything myself, she said to Pyotr Ivanovitch, moving on one side of the albums that lay on the table and noticing that the table was in danger from the cigarette ash. She promptly passed an ashtray to Pyotr Ivanovitch and said, I consider it affection to pretend that my grief prevents me from looking after practical matters. On the contrary, if anything could not console me but distract me, it is seeing after everything for him. She took out her handkerchief again, as though preparing to weep again, and suddenly, as though struggling with herself, she shook herself and began speaking calmly. But I've business to talk about with you. Pyotr Ivanovitch bowed, carefully keeping in check the springs of the ottoman, which had at once begun quivering under him. The last few days of his sufferings were awful. Did he suffer very much? Asked Pyotr Ivanovitch. Oh, awfully. For the last moments, hours indeed. He never left off screaming. For 3 days and nights in succession, he screamed incessantly. It was, oh, insufferable. I can't understand how I bore it. One could hear it through 3 closed doors. Ah, what I suffered. And was he conscious? Asked Pyotr Ivanovitch. Yes, she whimpered. Up to the last minute. He said goodbye to us a quarter of an hour before his death and asked Volodya to be taken away too. The thought of the sufferings of a man he had known so intimately, at first as a light-hearted boy, a schoolboy then, grown up as a partner at whist, in spite of the unpleasant consciousness of his own and this woman's hypocrisy, suddenly horrified Pyotr Ivanovitch. He saw that forehead, the nose that seemed squeezing the lip, and he felt frightened for himself. 3 days and nights of awful suffering and death. Why, that may at once, at any minute, come upon me too, he thought. He felt for an instant terrified, but immediately he could not himself have said it how, there came to his support the customary reflection that this had happened to Ivan Illich and not to him, that to him this must not and could not happen, that in thinking thus he was given way to depression, which was not the right thing to do, and was evident from Schwarz's expression of face, and making these reflections, Pyotr Ivanovitch felt reassured and began with interest inquiring details about Ivan Illich's end, and thought death were a mischance peculiar to Ivan Illich, but not at all incidental to himself. After various observations about the details of the truly awful physical surroundings endured by Ivan Illich, these details Pyotr Ivanovitch learned only through effect Ivan Illich's agonies had on the nerves of Praskovia Virinovas, the widow apparent thought it time to get to business. Ah, Pyotr Ivanovitch, how hard it is, how awfully hard! And she began to cry. Pyotr Ivanovitch sighed and waited for her to blow her nose. When she had done so, he said, "Indeed it is." And again she began to talk, and brought out what was evidently the business she wished to discuss with him. That business consisted in the inquiry as to how, on the occasion of her husband's death, she was to obtain a grant from the government. She made a show of asking Pyotr Ivanovitch's advice about a pension, but he perceived that she knew already to the minutest details what he did not know himself, indeed, everything that could be got out of the government on the ground of this death, but that what she wanted was to find out was whether there were not any such means, but after pondering a little, oh, whether there were not any means of obtaining a little more. Pyotr Ivanovitch tried to imagine the government for its stinginess, such means, but after pondering a little and after politeness abusing the government for its stinginess, he said that he believed that it was impossible to obtain more. Then she sighed and began unmistakably looking about for an excuse to get rid of her visitor. Her perceived this, put out his cigarette, got up, pressed her hand, and went out to the passage. In the dining room, where was the bric-a-brac clock that Ivan Illich had so delighted in buying, Pyotr Ivanovitch met the priest and several people he knew had come to the service for the dead, and saw too Ivan Illich's daughter, a handsome young lady. She was all in black. Her very slender figure looked even slenderer than usual. She had a gloomy, determined, and almost wrathful expression. She bowed to Pyotr Ivanovitch, determined, almost wrathful expression, as though he were to blame in some way. Behind the daughter, with the same offended air on his face, stood a rich young man whom Pyotr Ivanovitch knew too, an examining magistrate, the young lady's fiancé. As he had heard, he bowed dejectedly to him, and would have gone into the dead man's room, when from the staircase there appeared the figure of the son, the high school boy, extraordinarily like Ivan Illich. He was the little Ivan Illich over again, as Pyotr Ivanovitch remembered him at school. His eyes were red with crying, and had that look often seen in unclean boys of 13 or 14. The boy, seeing Pyotr Ivanovitch, scowled morosely and bashfully. Pyotr Ivanovitch nodded to him and went to the dead man's room. The service for the dead began. Candles, groans, incense, tears, sobs. Pyotr Ivanovitch stood frowning, staring at his feet in front of him. He did not once glance at the dead man, and right through the end did not once give way to depressing influences, and was one of the first to walk out. In the hall there was no one. Gerasim, the young peasant, darted out of the dead man's room, tossed over with his strong hand all the fur cloaks, to find Pyotr Ivanovich and give it to him. Well, Gerasim, my boy, said Pyotr Ivanovich, so as to say something. A sad business, isn't it? It's God's will. We shall overcome to the same, said Gerasim, showing his white, even peasant teeth in a smile, and like a man in a rush of his extra work, he briskly opened the door, called up to the coachman, saw Pyotr Ivanovich into the carriage, and darted back to the steps as though bethinking to himself of what he had to do next. Pyotr Ivanovich had a special pleasure in the fresh air after the smell of incense, of the corpse, and the carbolic acid. Where to? Said the coachman. It's not too late. I'll still go round to Fyodor Vasilievich's, and Pyotr Ivanovich drove there. And he did, in fact, find them just finishing the first rubber, so that he came just at the right time to take a hand. Part 2. The previous history of Ivan Ilych was the simplest, the most ordinary, and the most awful. Ivan Illich died at the age of 45. A member of the Judicial Council, he was the son of an official whose career in Petersburg through the various ministries and the departments had been such leads people to that position in which, though it is distinctively obvious that they are unfit to perform any kind of real duty, they yet cannot, owing to their long past service and their official rank, be dismissed, and they therefore received a specially created fictitious post, and by no means fictitious thousands from 6 to 10, on which they go on living till extreme old age. Such was the privy councillor, the superfluous member of various superfluous institutions. Ilya Imovich Golovin. He had 3 sons. Ivan Illich was the second son. The eldest son's career was exactly like his father's, only in a different department, and he was now close upon that stage in the service in which the same sincere would be reached. The third son was the unsuccessful one. He had, in various positions, always made a mess of things, and was now employed in the railway department. And his father and his brothers, and still more their wives, did not merely dislike meeting, but avoided, except in extreme necessity, recollecting his existence. His sister had married Baron Greff, a Petersburg official of the same stamp as his father-in-law. Ivan Illich was le fort de la famille, as people said. He was not so frigid and precise as the eldest son, nor so wild as the youngest. He was the happy man in between them, a shrewd, lively, pleasant, and well-bred man. He had been educated with his younger brother at the School of Jurisprudence. The younger brother had not finished the school course, but was expelled when he had just the same. He was later on in his life an intelligent fellow, considered to be his duty. Okaeri. He considered whatever was so, not totally as a boy, no later on grown up as a person, but from his earliest years he was attracted not as a fly to the light, to a persons of good standing in the world, assimilated their manners and their views of life, and established friendly relations with them. All in him he gave way to sensuality and to vanity, and latterly, which in the higher classes at school, to liberalism, but always keeping with certain limits which were unfailingly marked out for him in his instincts. At school, he committed actions to which had struck him before with brands of hate vileness, great vileness, and him feeling a loathing for himself at the very time at which committing them, but later on perceiving were not regarded by them as base, he was able not to regard them as good, but to forget them completely, and was never mortified by recollections of them. Leaving the school of jurisprudence in the 10th class and receiving from his father a sum of money for his outfit, Ivan Illich ordered his clothes at Chalmers, hung on his watch chain a medallion inscribed Respis Finem, said goodbye to the prince who was principal of school, had a farewell dinner with his comrades at Dondon's, and with his new fashionable belongings, traveling trunk, linen, suits and clothes, shaving and toilet appurtenances, and traveling rug, all ordered and purchased at the very best shops, set off to take the post of secretary on special commissions for the governor of province, a post which had been obtained for him by his father. In the province, Ivan Illich, without loss of time, made himself positions as easy and agreeable as his position had been in the school of jurisprudence. He did his work, made his career, and at the same time led a life of well bred social gaiety. Occasionally, he visited various districts on official duty, behaved with dignity both with his superiors and inferiors, and with exactitude and incorporable honesty of which he could not help feeling proud, performed the duties with which he was entrusted, principally having to do with the dissenters. When engaged in official work, he was, in spite of his youth and taste for frivolous amusements, exceedingly reserved, official, and even severe. But in social life, he was often amusing and witty, and always good natured, well bred, and bon enfant, as was said of him by his chief and chief's wife, with whom he was like one of the family. In the province, there was too a connection with one of the ladies who obtruded their charms in the stylish young lawyer. There was a dressmaker too, and there were drinking bouts with smart officers visiting the neighborhood, and visits to a certain outlying street after supper. There was a rather cringing obsequience in the behavior too with his chief and his chief's wife, but all this was accompanied with such a tone of the highest breeding that it could not be called by harsh names. It came under the rubric of the French saying, Il faut que les gens se passent. Everything was done with clean hands and clean shirts, with French phrases, and, what was of most importance, the highest society, and consequently with the approval of people of rank. Such was Ivan Illich's career for 5 years, and then came a change. In his official life, new methods of judicial procedure were established, new men were wanted to carry them out, and Ivan Illich became such a new man. Ivan Illich was offered the post of examining magistrate, and he accepted it in spite of the fact that his post was in another province, and he would have to break off all the ties he had formed and form new ones. Ivan Illich's friends met together to see him and had their photographs taken in a group, presented him with a silver cigarette case, and he set off to his new post. As an examining magistrate, Ivan Illich was comme il faut, as well as bred and adroit to keep official duties apart from private life, and as successful in gaining universal respects as he had been in Secretary of Private Commissions. The duties of his new office were in themselves of far greater interest and attractiveness for Ivan Illich. In his former posts, it had been pleasant to pass in his smart uniform from Charmers through the crowd of petitioners and official waiting timorously and envying him, and to march with his easy swagger straight into the governor's private room, there to sit down with him to tea and cigarettes. But the persons directly subject to his authority were few. The only such persons were the distinct police superintendents and the dissenters. When he was serving on special commissions, and he liked treating such persons affably, most almost like comrades, liked to make them feel that he, able to annihilate them, was behaving in his simple, friendly way with them. But such people were then few in number. Now, as an examining magistrate, Ivan Illich felt that everyone without exception, the most dignified, the most self satisfied people, all were in his hands, and that he had but to write certain words on a sheet of paper with a printed heading, and this dignified, self satisfied person would be brought before him in the capacity of defendant or a witness. And if he did not care to make him sit down, he would have to stand up before him and answer questions. Ivan Illich never abused the authority of his. On the contrary, he tried to soften the expression of it. But the consciousness of this power and the possibility of softening its effects constituted for him the chief interest and attractiveness of his new position. In the work itself, in the preliminary inquiries, that is, Ivan Illich very rapidly acquired the art of setting aside every consideration irrelevant to the official aspect of the case, and of reducing every case, however complex, to that form in which it could, in a purely external fashion, be put on paper, completely excluding his personal view of the matter, and what was of paramount importance, observing all necessary formalities. All this work was new, and he was one of the first men who put into practical working the reforms in judicial procedure enacted in 1864. On settling in a new town in his position as examining magistrate, Ivan Illich made new acquaintances, formed new ties, and took up a new line and adopted a rather different attitude. He took up an attitude of somewhat dignified aloofness toward that of provincial authorities, while he picked out the best circle among the legal gentlemen and wealthy gentry living in the town, and adopted a tone of slight dissatisfaction with the government, moderate liberalism, and lofty civic virtue. With this, while making no change in the elegance of his get free to grow as it liked, Ivan Illich's existence in the new town proved the governor was friendly and good. His income was larger, and he found a source of increased enjoyment in whilst at which he began to play at this time, and having a faculty for playing cards good humoredly and being rapid and exact in his calculations, he was as a rule on the winning side. I'm taking a moment now to look off in the distance, abiding by the 20-20-20 rule per se, keeping my eyes with the vision set at least 20 feet away for at least 20 seconds. 20 seconds, 20 feet away. It's technically supposed to be for every 20 minutes at least. And let's see here. Oh, I've already been reading for nearly 40 minutes. It seems that I am doubly overdue for this. So far, I like the way Tolstoy writes. It's like funny and whimsical. I think that is about enough time staring into the distance to protect my eyesight. I have started to get myopia. Want to prevent that from exacerbating. Let's go. Wait, let's drink some water. Hi. After living 2 years in the new town, Ivan Illich met his future wife. Praskovia Fyodorova Michel was the most attractive, clever, and brilliant girl in the set in which Ivan Illich moved. Among other, Illich started a light, playful flirtation with Praskovia Vardanova. Ivan Illich, when he was an assistant secretary, had danced as a rule. As an examining magistrate, he danced only as an exception. He danced now as if it were under protest, as though to show that though I am serving on the new reformed legal code and am of the fifth class in official rank, still, if it comes to a question of dancing, in that line too, I can do better than the others. In this spirit, he danced now and then towards the end of the evening with Praskovia Fyodorova. And it was principally during these dances that he won the heart of Praskovia Fyodorovna. Fyodorovna. She fell in love with him. Ivan Illich had no clearly defined intention of marrying, but when the girl fell in love with him, he put the question to himself. After all, why not get married? He said to himself. The young lady, Praskovia Fyodorovna, was good family, nice looking, and there was a little bit of property. Ivan Illich might have reckoned on a more brilliant match, but this was a good match. Ivan Illich had his salary. She, he hoped, would have as much of her own. It was a good family. She was a sweet, pretty, and perfectly comme il faut young woman. To say that Ivan Illich got married because he fell in love with his wife and found her in sympathy with the views of his life would be as untrue as to say that he got married because the people of his world approved of the match. Ivan Illich was influenced by both considerations. He was doing what was agreeable to himself in securing such a wife, and at the same time doing what persons of higher standards looking upon as the corrected thing. And thus, Ivan Illich got married. The process itself of getting married and the early period of married life, with the conjugal caresses and the new furniture and the new crockery and the new house linen, all up to the time of his wife's pregnancy, went off very well. So that Ivan Illich had already begun to think that so far from the marriage breaking up, this kind of frivolous, agreeable, hearted life, always decorous and always approved by society, which he regarded as normal life, it would even increase its agreeableness. But at that point, in the early months of his wife's pregnancy, there came in a new element, unexpected, unpleasant, tiresome, and unseemly, which could never been anticipated and from which there was no escape. His wife, without any kind of reason, it seemed to Ivan Illich, der Greit Krossofor, he expressed it, began to disturb the agreeableness and decorum of their life. She began, without any sort of justification, to be jealous, exacting in her demands on his attention, squabbled over everything, and treated him to the coarsest and most unpleasant scenes. Ah, at first, Ivan Illich hoped to escape from the unpleasantness of this position by taking up some frivolous and well bred line that had served him well on other occasions of difficulty. He endeavored to ignore his wife's ill humor, went on living light-heartedly and agreeably as before, invited friends to play cards, tired to get away himself to the club or his friends. But his wife began on one occasion with such energy, abusing him in such coarse language, and so obstinately persisted in her abuse of him every time that he failed in carrying out her demands, obviously having made up her mind firmly to persist till he gave way, that is, stayed at home and was as dull as she was, that Ivan Illich took alarm. He perceived that matrimony, at least with his wife, was not invariably conducive to the pleasures and proprieties of life, but, on the contrary, often destructive of them, and it was therefore essential to erect some barrier to protect himself from these disturbances, and Ivan Illich began to look for such means of protecting himself. His official duties were the only thing that impressed Praskovia Fyodorovna, and Ivan Illich began to use his official position and the duties arising from it in his struggle with his wife to fence off his own independent world apart. With the birth of the baby, the attempts at nursing it, the various unsuccessful experiments with foods, with the illnesses, real and imaginary, of the infant and its mother, in which Ivan Illich was expected to sympathize, though he never had the slightest idea about them, the need for him to fence off a world apart for him outside his family life still more imperative. As his wife grew more irritable and exacting, so did Ivan Illich, more and more transferred to the center of gravity of his life to his official work. He began fonder and fonder of official life, and more ambitious than he had been. Very quickly, not more than a year after his wedding, Ivan Illich had become aware that conjugal life, though providing certain comforts, was in reality a very intricate and difficult business towards which one must, if one is to do one's duty, that is, lead the decorous and life approved by society, work out for oneself a definite line, just as in the government service. And such a line Ivan Illich did work for himself in his married life. He expected from his home life only those comforts of dinner at home, of housekeeper, and bed which it could give him, and, above all, that perfect propriety in external observances required by public opinion. For the rest, he looked for good humored pleasantries. And if he found it, he was very thankful. If he met with antagonism and querulousness, he promptly retreated into the separate world he had shut off for himself in official life, and there he found solace. Ivan, Ivan Illich was prized as a good official, and 3 years later he was made assistant public prosecutor. The new duties of this position, their dignity, the possibility of bringing anyone to trial and putting anyone in prison, the publicity of the speeches and successes Ivan Illich had in that part of his work, all this made his official work still more attractive to him. Children were born to him. His wife became steadily more querulous and ill tempered, but the line Ivan Illich had taken up for himself in home life put him almost out of reach of her grumbling. After 7 years of service in the same town, Ivan Illich was transferred to another province with the post of public prosecutor. They moved. Money was short, and his wife did not like the place they had moved to. The salary was indeed a little higher than before, but their expenses were larger. Besides, a couple of children had died, and home life consequently became even less agreeable for Ivan Illich. Oh, he had a couple kids die, and home life isn't fun right now. For every mischance that occurred in their new place of residence, Praskovia Fyodorovna blamed her husband. The greater number of subjects of conversation between husband and wife, especially the education of children, led to questions which were associated with previous quarrels, and quarrels were ready to break out in every instant. There remained only those rare periods of being in love, which did indeed come upon them, but never lasted long. These were the islands at which they put in for a time, but they soon set off again upon their ocean of concealed hostility, that it was made manifest in their aloofness from one another. This aloofness might have distressed Ivan Illich if he had believed that this ought not to be so, but by now he regarded this position as perfectly normal, and it was indeed the goal towards which he worked in his home life. His aim was to make himself more and more free from the unpleasant aspects of domestic life and to render them harmless and decorous. And he attained this aim by spending less and less time with his family. And when he was forced to be at home, he endeavored to secure his tranquility by presence of outsiders. The great thing for Ivan Illich was having his office. In the official world, all the interest of life was concentrated for him, and this interest absorbed him. This sense of his own power, the consciousness of being and able to ruin anyone he wanted to ruin, even the external dignity of his office. When he made his entry into the court or met subordinate officials, his success in the eyes of his superiors and subordinates, and, above all, his masterly handling of cases of which he was conscious. All this delighted him, and together with chat with his colleagues, dining out, and whilst filled his life so that on the whole Ivan Illich's life still went on in the way he thought it should go, agreeably and decorously. So he lived for another 7 years. His eldest daughter was already 16. Another child had died, and there was left only one other, a boy at the high school, a subject of dissension. Ivan Illich wanted to send him to the school of jurisprudence, while Praskovia Fyodorovna, to spite him, sent him to the high school. The daughter had been educated at home and turned out well. The boy, too, did fairly at his lessons. That ends section 2. We are now going to have an intermission if you're actually watching this at any point in the future. This has been one of the most fun books to read as someone who has read maybe 1,000 books in my lifetime. Quite rarely have I ever laughed this often or this hard, but maybe it is the author's way of writing. I've always known Leo Tolstoy to be a quite how can I compliment him in a way? A giant in his field, but never have I given him the time of day. Intermission. Okay, intermission is ending momentarily. We will begin chapter 3 at the 1 hour mark. A little bit of stretching. Do some move. Think I have everything. My hair looks good. Chapter 3. Such was Ivan Illich's life for 17 years after his marriage. She had been by now a long while prosecutor and had refused several appointments offered to him, looking out for a more desirable post when there occurred an unexpected incident which utterly destroyed his peace of mind. Ivan Illich had been expecting to be an appointed presiding judge in a university town, but a certain Kope somehow stole a march on him and secured the appointment. Ivan Illich took offense, began upbraiding him, and quarreled with him and with his own superiors. A coolness was felt towards him, and on the next appointment that was made, he was again passed over. This was now the year 1880. That year was the most painful one in Ivan Illich's life. During that year, it became evident, on the one hand, that his pay was insufficient for his expenses, on the other hand, that he had been forgotten by everyone. It appeared to other people as a quite commonplace fact. Even his father felt no obligation to assist him. He felt that everyone had deserted him, and that everyone regarded his position with an income of 3,500 rubles as a quite normal and even fortunate one. He alone, with a sense of the injustice done to him, and the everlasting nagging of his wife and the debts he had begun to accumulate, living beyond his normal means, he knew that his position was far from normal. The summer of that year, to cut down on his expenses, he took a holiday and went with his wife to spend the summer in the country at her brother's. In the country, with no official duties to occupy him, Ivan Illich was for the first time a prey not to simple boredom, but to intolerable depression. And he made up his mind that things could not go on like that, and that it was absolutely necessary to take some decisive steps. After a sleepless night spent by Ivan Illich walking up and down the terrace, he determined to go to Petersburg to take active steps to get transferred to some other department, so as to revenge himself on them and the people, that is, who had not known how to appreciate him. Next day, in spite of all the efforts of his wife and of his mother-in-law to dissuade him, he sent off to St. Petersburg. He went with a single object before him to obtain a post with an income of 5,000. He was ready now to be satisfied with a post in any department of any tendency, with any kind of work. He must only have a post with 5,000 in the executive department, the banks, the railways, the Empress Marina's institutions, even in the customs duty, which was essentially 5,000, and essential it was too to get out of the department of which they had failed to appreciate his value. And behold, this quest of Ivan Illich was crowned with wonderful, unexpected success. At Kursk, there got into the same first class carriage F.S. Ilyin, an acquaintance, who told him of a telegram carriage received by the governor of Kursk announcing a change about to take place in the ministry. Pyotr Ivanovich was to be superseded by Ivan Semyonovich. The proposed change, apart from its significance for Russia, had special significance for Ivan Illich from the fact that by bringing to the front a new person, Pyotr Petrovich had obviously, therefore, his friend Zahar Ivanovich, it was in the highest degree propitious propitious to Ivan Illich's own plans. Zahar Ivanovich was a friend and schoolfellow of Ivan Illich's. At Moscow, the news was confirmed. On arriving to St. Petersburg, Ivan Illich looked up Zahar Ivanovich and received a positive promise of an appointment in his former department, that of justice. A week later, he telegraphed to his wife, Zahar Miller's place. At first report, I receive appointment. Thanks to these changes, Ivan Illich unexpectedly obtained in the same department as before an appointment in which placed him 2 stages higher than his former colleagues, and gave him an income of 5,000, together with the official allowance of 3,500 for traveling expenses. All this ill humor with his former enemies and the whole department was forgotten, and Ivan Illich was now completely happy. Ivan Illich went back to the country more light-hearted and good-tempered than he had been for a very long while. Praskovia Fyodorovna was in better spirits too, and peace was patched up between them. Ivan Illich described what respect everyone had shown to him in Petersburg, how all those who had been his enemies had been put to shame and were now cringing before him, how envious they were of his appointment, and still more of the high favor in which he stood at Petersburg. Praskovia Fyodorovna listened to this and pretended to believe it, and did not contradict him in anything, but confined herself to making plans for her new arrangements in the town to which they will be moving. And Ivan Illich saw with delight that these plans were his plans, and they were agreed, and that his life, after disturbing hitch its progress, was about to regain its true normal character of light-hearted agreeableness and propriety. Ivan Illich had come back to the country for a short stay only. He had to enter upon the duties of his new office on the 10th of September, and besides, he needed some time to settle in a new place, to move all his belongings from other province, to purchase and order many things in addition. In short, to arrange things as settled in his own mind, and almost exactly as settled in the heart, too, of Praskovia Fyodorovna. And now, when everything was so successfully arranged, and when he and his wife were agreed in their aim, and were, besides, so little together, they got on with one another as they had not got on together in early years of their married life. Ivan Illich had thought of taking his family away with him at once, but his sister and his brother-in-law, who had suddenly become extremely cordial and intimate with him and his family, were so pressing and urging them to stay that he set off alone. Ivan Illich started off, and the light-hearted temper produced by his success and his good understanding with his wife, one thing backing up another, did not desert him all the time. He found a charming set of apartments, the very thing both husband and wife had dreamt of. Spacious, lofty reception rooms in the old style, a comfortable, dignified-looking study for him, rooms for his wife and daughter, a schoolroom for his son, everything as though planned on purpose for them. Ivan Illich himself looked after the furnishings of them, chose the wallpapers, bought furniture, by preference antique furniture, which had a peculiar comme il faut style to his mind. And it all grew up and really attained the ideal he had set before himself. When he had half finished arraigning the house, his arraignment surpassed his own expectations. He saw comme il faut character, elegant and free from vulgarity, that the whole would have when it was all ready. As he fell asleep, he pictured to himself the reception room as it would be. Looking at the drawing room, not yet finished, he could see hearth, the screen, the etagere, and the little chairs dotted here and there, the plates and dishes on the walls, and the bronzes as they would be when they were all put in their places. He was delighted with the thought of how he would impress Praskovia and Lizanka, who had taste too in this line. They would never expect anything like it. He was particularly successful in comparing across and buying cheap old pieces of furniture, which gave a peculiarly aristocratic air to the whole. In his letters, he purposely disparaged everything so as to surprise them. All this so absorbed him that the duties of his new office, though he was so fond of his official work, interested him less than he had expected. During his sittings of the court, he had his moments of inattention. He pondered the question of which sort of cornices to have on the window blinds, straight or fluted. He was so interested in this business that he often set to work with his own hands, moved a piece of furniture, or hung up curtains himself. One day he went up a ladder to show a workman, who did not understand, how he wanted some hangings draped, made a false step, and slipped. But, like a strong and nimble person, he clung on, and only knocked his side against the corner of a frame. The bruised place ached, but it soon passed off. Ivan Illich felt all this time particularly good humored and well. He wrote, I felt 15 years younger. He thought his house furnishing would be finished in September, but it dragged on to the middle of October. But then the effect was charming. Not only he said so, but everyone who saw it told him so too. In reality, it was all just what is commonly seen in the houses of people who are not exactly wealthy, but want to look like wealthy people and so succeed only in being like one another. Hangings, dark wood, flowers, rugs, and bronzes, everything dark and highly polished, everything that all people of a certain class have so as to be like all people of a certain class. And in his case, it was all so like it made no impression at all. But as it all seemed to him somehow special, when he met his family at the railway station and brought them to his newly furnished rooms, all lighted up in readiness, and a footman in a white tie opened the door to an entry decorated with flowers, and then they walked into the drawing room and the study, uttering cries of delight. He was very happy, conducted them everywhere, eagerly drinking in their praises, and beaming with satisfaction. The same evening, while they talked about various things at tea, Praskovia Fyodorovna inquired about his fall, and he laughed and showed them how he had gone flying and how he had frightened the upholsterer. Ah ha ha. It's as well I'm something of an athlete. Another man might have been killed, and I got nothing worse than a blow here. When it touched, it hurts, but it's going off already. Nothing but a bruise. And they began to live in their new abode, which, as is always the case, when they had got thoroughly settled and found to be short of just one room, and with their new income, which, as always, was only a little, some 500 rubles, too little, and everything went very well. At first. Before everything was quite finally arranged and there was still something to do to the place, something to buy, something to order, something to move, something to make fit. Though there were indeed several disputes between husband and wife, both were so well satisfied and so much to do that it all went off without serious quarrels. When there was nothing left to arrange, it became a little dull and something seemed to be lacking. But by then they were making acquaintances and forming habits, and life was filled up again. Ivan Illich, after spending the morning in court, returned home to dinner, and at first he was generally in a good humor, although this was apt to be upset by a little, and precisely on account of the new abode. Every spot on the tablecloth, on the hangings, on the string of a window blind broken, irritated him. He had devoted so much trouble to the arrangement of the rooms that any disturbance of their order distressed him. But on the whole, the life of Ivan Illich ran its course as according to its conviction life ought to do, easily, agreeably, and decorously. He got up at 9, drank his coffee, read the newspaper, and then put on his official uniform and went to court. There the routine of daily work was already mapped out for him, and he stepped into it at once. People with petitions, inquiries in the office itself, the sittings, public and preliminary. In all this, the great thing necessary was to exclude everything with the sap of life in it, which always disturbs the regular course of official business, not to admit any sort of relations with people except the official relations. The motive of all intercourse had to be simply the motive official, and the intercourse itself to be only official. A man would come, for instance, anxious for certain information. Ivan Illich, not being the functionary on duty, would have nothing whichever to do with such a man. But if this man's relation to him as a member of the court is such as can be formulated on official stamped paper within the limits of such relation, Ivan Illich would do everything, positively everything he could, and in doing so would observe the semblance of human friendly relations, that is, the courtesies of social life. But where the official relations ended, there everything else stopped too. This art of keeping the official aspect of things apart from his real life, Ivan Illich possessed in the highest degree, and though long practice of natural aptitude, he had brought it to such a pitch of perfection that he even permitted himself at times, like a skilled specialist as it were in jest, to let the human and official relations mingle. He allowed himself this liberty just because he felt he had the power at any moment, if he wished it, to take up the purely official line again and to drop the human relation. This thing was not simply easy, agreeable, and decorous in Ivan Illich's hands, it attained a positively artistic character. In the intervals of business, he smoked, drank tea, chatted a little about politics and a little about public affairs, a little about cards, but most of all about appointments in the service. And tired, but feeling like some artist who has skillfully played his part in the performance, one of the first violins in the orchestra, he returned home. At home, his daughter and her mother had been paying some calls somewhere, or else someone had been calling on them. The son had been at school, had been preparing his lessons with his teachers, and duly learning correctly what was taught at the high school. Everything was as it should be. After dinner, if there were no visitors, Ivan Illich sometimes read some book of which people were talking, and in the evening sat down to work, that is, read official papers, compared them with the laws, sorted dispositions, and then, under the laws, this he found neither tiresome nor entertaining. It was tiresome when he might have been playing bridge, but if there were no bridge going on, it was anyway better than sitting alone with his wife. Ivan Illich's pleasures were little dinners to which he invited ladies and gentlemen of good social position, and such methods of passing the time with them as were usual with such persons, so that his drawing room might be like other drawing rooms, Once they even gave a party, a dance, and Ivan Illich enjoyed it, and everything was very successful, except that it led to a violent quarrel with his wife over the tarts and sweetmeats. Praskovia Frodorovna had her own plan, while Ivan Illich insisted on getting everything from an expensive pastry cook and ordering a great many tarts. And the quarrel was because these tarts were left over, and the tarts and the party cook's bill came to 45 rubles. The quarrel was a violent and unpleasant one, so much so that Praskovia Fyodorovna called him a fool, an imbecile, and he clutched at his head, and his anger made some allusion as to a divorce. But the party itself was enjoyable. They were all the best people, and Ivan Illich danced with Princess Trufonov, the sister of the one who's so well known in connection with the charitable association called Bear My Burden. His official pleasures lay in the gratification of his pride. His social pleasures lay in the gratification of his vanity. But Ivan Illich's most real pleasure was in the pleasure of playing bridge. He admitted himself that, after all, after whatever unpleasant incidents there had been in his life, the pleasure which burned like a candle before all others was sitting with good players and not noisy partners at bridge. And of course, a four-handed game. Playing with five was never a success, though one pretends to like it particularly. And with good cards to be played a shrewd, serious game, then supper and a glass of wine, and after a bridge, especially after winning some small stakes, winning large sums was unpleasant. Ivan Illich went to bed in a particularly happy frame of mind. So they lived. They moved in the very best circle and were visited by people of consequence and young people. In their views of their circle of acquaintances, the husband, the wife, and the daughter were in complete accord, and without any expressed agreement on the subject, they all acted alike in dropping and shaking off various friends and relations, shabby persons who swooped down upon them in their drawing room with Japanese plates on the walls and pressed their civilities on them. Soon these shabby persons ceased fluttering about them, and none but the very best society was seen at the Golovins. Young men began to pay attention to Lizanka and Petrishchev, the son of Dmitri Ivanovich Petrishchev, and the sole heir of his fortune. The examining magistrate began to be so attentive to Lizanka that Ivan Illich had raised the question with his wife whether it would be as well to arrange a sledge drive for them, or to get up some theatricals. So they lived, and everything went on this way without change, and everything was nice. That concludes part three, chapter three. And I wouldn't call chapter three a filler, but it wasn't a humor filled comedy, almost as I would depict the first two. Let us keep going. Why not? It is nearly 8:10 local time. I had quite a long nap on accident after dinner. So, I'm not tired, despite knowing I have work in the morning, and I'm not yet yawning. Hmm. Let us continue fighting. All were in good health. One could not use the word ill health in connection with the symptoms Ivan Illich sometimes complained of, namely, a queer taste in his mouth and a sort of uncomfortable feeling on the left side of his stomach. But it came to pass this unfortunate feeling kept increasing and became not exactly a pain, but a continual sense of weight in his side and irritable temper. This irritable temper, continually growing and growing, began at last to mar the agreeable easiness and decorum that had reigned in the Golovin household. Quarrels between the husband and wife became more and more frequent. and soon all the easiness and amenity of life had fallen away, and mere propriety was maintained with difficulty. Scenes became again more frequent. Again, there were only islands on the sea of contention, and but few of these which the husband and wife could meet without an outbreak. And Praskovia Frodorovna said now, not without grounds, that her husband had a trying temper. With her characteristic exaggeration, she said he had always had this awful temper, and she had needed all her sweetness to put up with it for 20 years. It was true that he was now who began the quarrels. His gusts of tempers always broke out just before dinner, and often just as he was beginning to eat at the soup. He would notice that some piece of the cookery had been chipped, or that the food was not nice, or that his son put his elbow on the table, or that his daughter's hair was not as he had liked it. And whatever it was, he laid the blame on it on Praskovia Fyodorovna, his wife. At first, she retorted in the same strain and said all sorts of horrid things to him. But on two occasions, just at the beginning of dinner, he flown into such a frenzy that she perceived that it was due to physical derangement and was brought on by taking food. She controlled herself. She did not rely, but simply made it haste to get dinner. Over Praskovia Frodonova took great credit to herself for this exercise of self control. Making up her mind that her husband had a fearful temper and made her life miserable, she began to feel sorry for herself. And the more she felt for herself, the more she hated her husband. She began to wish he were dead, yet could not wish it against him even more, because there would be no income, and this exasperated her against him even more. She considered herself dreadfully unfortunate, precisely because even his death could not save her, and she felt irritated and concealed it, and this hidden irritation on her side increased his irritability. After one violent scene in which Ivan Illich had been particularly unjust, and after which he had said in explanation that he certainly was irritable, but that it was due to illness, she said that if he were ill, he ought to take steps, and insisted on going to see a celebrated doctor. He went. Everything was as he expected. Everything was as it always is. The waiting and the assumption of dignity, that professional dignity he knew so well, exactly as he assumed it himself in court, and sounding and listening and questions that called for answers that were foregone conclusions and obviously superfluous, and the significant air that seemed to insinuate, "You only leave it all to us, and we will arrange everything for us. It is certain and incontestable how to arrange everything. Everything in one way for every man of every sort." It was all exactly as his court of justice, exactly the same air as he put on in dealing with a man brought up for judgment, the doctor put on in for him. The doctor said, "This and that proves you have such and such a thing wrong inside you. But if that is not confirmed by analysis of this and that, then we must assume that this and that. If we assume that this and that, then this and that," so on and so on. To Ivan Illich, there were only one question of consequence: was his condition dangerous or not? But the doctor ignored that irrelevant inquiry. From the doctor's point of view, this was a side issue, not the subject under consideration. The only real question was the balance of probabilities between a loose kidney, chronic cataract, and appendicitis. It was not a question of the life of Ivan Illich, but the question between loose kidney and the intestinal appendix. And this question, as it seemed to Ivan Illich, the doctor solved in a brilliant manner in favor of the appendix, with the reservation that the analysis of the water might give a fresh clue, and that then the aspect of the case would be altered. All this was point for point identical with what Ivan Illich had himself done in brilliant fashion 1,000 times over in dealing with some man on his trial. Just as brilliantly, the doctor made his summoning up, and triumphantly, gaily even, glanced over his spectacles at the prisoner in the dock. From the doctor's summoning up, Ivan Illich deduced the conclusion that things looked bad, and that he, the doctor, and most likely everyone else, did not care, but that things looked bad for him. And this conclusion impressed Ivan Illich morbidly, arousing in him a great feeling of pity for himself, of great anger against the doctor who could be unconcerned about a matter of such importance. But he said nothing of that. He got up, and laying the fee on the table, he said with a sigh, "We sick people probably often ask inconvenient questions. Tell me, is this generally a dangerous illness or not?" The doctor glanced severely at him with one eye through his spectacles, as though to say, "Prisoner at the bar, if you will not keep within the limits of the questions allowed to you, I shall be compelled to take measures for your removal from the precincts of the court." "I have told you what I thought necessary and suitable already," said the doctor. "The analysis will show anything further." And the doctor bowed him out. Ivan Illich went out slowly and dejectedly, got into his sledge, and drove home. All the way home, he was incessantly going over all the doctor had said, trying to translate these complicated, obscure scientific phrases into simple language, and read in them an answer to the question, "It's bad. It is very bad." Or "Nothing much as yet?" And it seemed to him that the upshot of all Doctor had said was that it was very bad. Everything seemed dismal to Ivan Illich in the streets. The sledge drivers were dismal, the houses were dismal, the people passing, the shops were dismal. This ache, this dull, gnawing ache that never ceased for a second, seemed, when connected with the doctor's obscure utterances, to have gained a new, more serious significance. With a new sense of misery, Ivan Illich kept watch on it now. He reached home and began to tell his wife about it. His wife listened, but in the middle of his account, his daughter came in with her hat on, ready to go out with her mother. Reluctantly, she half sat down to listen to these tedious details. But she could not stand it for long, and her mother did not hear the story to the end. "Well, I'm very glad," said his wife. "Now you must be sure to take the medicine regularly. Give me the prescription, and I'll send to get it seen to the chemist's." And she went out to get ready and then to go out. She did not take breath while she was in the room, and she heaved a deep sigh when she was gone. "Well," he said, "maybe it really she's nothing as yet. Maybe it really isn't, anything at all." He began to take the medicine to carry out the doctor's directions, which were changed after the analysis of the water. But it was just at this point some confusion arose, either in the analysis or in what ought to have followed from it. The doctor himself, of course, could not have be blamed for it, but it turned out that things had not gone as the doctor had told him. Either he'd forgotten or told a lie, or was hiding something from him. But Ivan Illich still went on exactly carrying out the doctor's direction, and in doing so, he found comfort at first. From the time of his visit to the doctor, Ivan Illich's principal occupation became the exact observance of the doctor's prescriptions as regards hygiene and medicine, and careful observation of his ailment in all the functions of his organism. Ivan Illich's principal interests came to be people's ailments and people's health. When anything was said about his presence about sick people, about deaths and recoveries, especially in the case of an illness resembling his own, he listened, trying to conceal his excitement, asked questions, and applied what he had heard to his own trouble. The ache did not grow less, but Ivan Illich made great efforts to force himself to believe that he was better, and he succumbed in deceiving himself so long as nothing happened to disturb him. But as soon as he had a mischance, some unpleasant words with his wife, a failure in his official work, an unlucky hand at bridge, he was at once acutely sensible of his illness. In former days he had borne with such mishaps, hoping to soon retrieve the mistake, to make a struggle, to reach success later, to have a lucky hand, but now he was cast down by every mischance and reduced to despair. He would say to himself, "Here I am only just beginning to get better, and the medicate has begun to take effect, and now this mischance or disappointment." And he was furious against the mischance or the people who were causing him the disappointment and killing him. And he felt that this fury was killing him, but could not check it. One would have thought that it should have been clear to him that this exasperation against circumstances and people was aggravating his disease, and that therefore he ought to not pay attention to the unpleasant incidences, but his reasoning took quite the opposite direction. He said that he needed peace, and was on the watch for everything that disturbed his peace, and at the slightest disturbance of it he flew into a rage. What made his position worse was that he read medical books and consulted doctors. He got worse so gradually that he might have deceived himself. Comparing one day with another, the difference was so slight, but when he consulted the doctors, then it seemed to him that he was getting worse, and very rapidly so. Indeed, and in spite of this, he was continually consulting the doctors. That month, he called on another celebrated doctor. The second celebrity said almost the same as the first, but he put his questions differently, and the interview with his celebrity only redoubled the doubts and terrors of Ivan Illich. A friend of his, a very good doctor, diagnosed the disease quite differently, and in spite of the fact that he guaranteed recovery by his questions and suppositions, he confused Ivan Illich even more and strengthened his suspicions. A homeopath gave yet another diagnosis of the complaint and prescribed medicine, which Ivan Illich took secretly for a week. But after a week of the homeopathic medicine, he felt no relief from the medication, and losing faith both in the other doctor's treatment and in this, he fell into an even deeper depression. One day, a lady of his acquaintance talked to him of the healing wrought by icons. Ivan Illich caught himself listening attentively and believing in the reality of the facts alleged. This incident alarmed him. "Can I have degenerated to such a point of intellectual feebleness?" he said to himself. "Nonsense! It's all rubbish. I must not give way to nervous fears, but fixing on one doctor, adhere strictly to his treatment. That's what I will do. Now it's settled. I won't think about it. But till next summer I will stick to the treatment. Then I shall see. Now I'll put a stop to this wavering." It was easy to say this, but impossible to carry out. The pain in his side was always dragging at him, seeming to grow more acute and ever incessant. It seemed to him that the taste in his mouth was queerer, and there was a loathsome smell even from his breath, and his appetite and strength kept dwindling. There was no deceiving himself. Something terrible, new, and so important that nothing more important had ever been in Ivan Illich's life was to taking place in him, and he alone knew it. All about him did not or would not understand and believed that everything in this world was going on as before. This was what tortured Ivan Illich more than anything, those of his own household. Most of all, his wife and daughter, who were absorbed in a perfect whirl of visits, did not, he saw, comprehend it at all, and were annoyed that he was so depressed and exacting, as though he were to blame for it. Though they tried indeed to disguise it, he saw he was a nuisance to them, but that his wife had taken up a definite line of her own in regard to his illness, and stuck to it regardless of what he might say and do. This line was expressed thus: "You know," she would say to acquaintances, "Ivan Illich cannot, like all other simple hearted folks, keep to the treatments prescribed to him. One day he'll take his drops and eat what he's ordered and go to bed and like all that and good time. The next day I don't see it and he suddenly forgot to take his medicine, eat sturgeon, which is forbidden by the doctors. Yes, and then take a bridge past midnight. Why would I do that? Ivan Illich asked in vexation one day at Pyotr Ivanovich's. Why yesterday was Shebek? It makes no difference. I couldn't sleep for pain. Well, it doesn't matter what you do for only you never get well like that. And you make us wretched. Praskovia Fyodorovna's external attitude to her husband's illness, openly expressed to others and to himself, was that Ivan Illich was to blame for the matter of his illness, and that the whole illness was another injury he was doing to his wife. Ivan Illich felt that the expression of this dropped from her unconsciously, but that made it no easier for him. In his official life, too, Ivan Illich noticed, or fancied he'd noticed, a strange attitude to him. At one time, it seemed to him that people were looking inquisitively at him, as a man who would shortly have to vacate his position. At another time, his friends would suddenly be chaffing him in a friendly way over his nervous fears, as though that awful and horrible, unheard of thing that was going on with him, in incessantly gnawing at him and irresistibly dragging him away somewhere, were the most agreeable subject for joking Schwartz, especially with his jocosness, his liveliness, and his comme il faut tone, ex- exacerbated Ivan Illich by reminding him of himself 10 years ago. Friends came sometimes to play cards. They sat down to the card table. They shuffled and dealt the new cards. Diamonds were led and followed by diamonds, the seven. His partner said, "Can't trump," and played the two of diamonds. What then? Why, delightful capital it should have been. He had a trump hand, and suddenly Ivan Illich feels that gnawing ache, that taste in his mouth, and it strikes him as something grotesque, that which he could be glad of a trump hand. He looks at Mikhail Mikhailovich, his partner, how he taps on the table with his red hand and affably and indulgently abstains from snatching up the trick, and pushes the cards towards Ivan Illich so that to give him the pleasure of taking them up without any trouble, without even stretching out his hand. What does he suppose? That I'm so weak that I can't stretch out my hand, thinks Ivan Illich, and he forgets the trumps and trumps his partner's cards and plays his trump hand without making three tricks. And what's the most awful thing of all this is that he sees how upset Mikhail Mikhailovich is about it. Well, he doesn't care a bit, and it's awful for him to think why he doesn't care. They all see that he's in pain and say to him, "We can't stop if you're tired. You go and lay down." Lie down? No, he's not in the least tired. They will play the rubber. All are gloomy and silent. Ivan Illich feels that it is he who has brought this gloom upon them, and he cannot disperse it. They have supper, and the party breaks up, and Ivan Illich is left alone with the consciousness that his life is poisoned for him and poisonous for the life of others, and that this poison is not losing its force, but is continually penetrating more and more deeply into his whole existence. And with the consciousness of this, and with the physical pain in addition, and the terror in addition to that, he must lie in his bed, often not to be able to sleep for pain, the greater part of the night. And in the morning he must get up again, dress, and go to the law court, speak, write, or if he does not go out, stay at home for all the 24 hours of the day and night, of which each one is a torture, and he had to live thus on the edge of the precipice alone, without one who would understand and feel for him. That ends chapter 4. Do the math real quick. I just read exactly 50% of the book. So I will read the other half in one sitting as well, probably. And so this book total is probably a 3 hour read. And then I'm taking different intermissions. The pages take about 3 minutes to read, which is a lot more than some books take like 1 or 2 minutes. If you have actually watched this, if there's anybody who's actually ever watched this in the future once it's been posted, thank you for your time.